Welcome back to the CSP Elite Baseball Development Podcast. I'm your host, Eric Cressey, and this is episode 54 of Pinch Hit Friday. I'm going to preface this by saying this is going to be a nerd episode. This is going to be great for a lot of the rehab specialists out there, strength and conditioning coaches, and anybody in the baseball realm that really gets excited about anatomy and current research as it relates to shoulder and elbow stuff. And really what I want to talk about is scapular anterior tilt. This is somewhat timely given that my product, thoracic outlet syndrome diagnosis and interventions, is actually on sale through Sunday the 12th at midnight. So you can check that out at ericcressey.com/thoracic outlet and link through. It was a really cool project we did with the Fascia Training Academy with cadaver dissections included and lots of strategies related to correcting these issues that may predispose athletes to thoracic outlet. And really one of the big players in this is scapular anterior tilt, which we'll talk about. But big picture, that's on sale for $50 off through Sunday at midnight. So check it out at ericcressey.com/thoracic outlet. Now let's get to the actual conversation about why this is a big issue. This is a timely, presentation just simply because there was an article that just came out in the Journal of Clinical Medicine. The title on it is A Prospective Analysis of Scapular Positioning Patterns and Shoulder and Elbow Injury Susceptibility in Professional Baseball Pitchers. Kevin Loudner was the lead researcher on it, who's done some great stuff with altered blood flow into the upper extremity of baseball players, but also Regan Wong with the Texas Rangers, super sharp physical therapy, and then Dr. Keith Meister, who should need no introduction, but was an awesome guest here on the podcast, was also one of the investigators on it. And basically what they did was they took 85 professional pitchers from a single professional baseball organization, and they had their scapular positions and motions measured. They used the digital goniometer prior to the start of a competitive season, so spring training measurements. And then what they did was they basically just followed them over the course of the season to see what would happen with their shoulder and elbows with respect to overuse injuries. And so what they found was there were 34 players of the 85 that were injured, and then there were obviously 51 that didn't get injured. And they found that pitchers who sustained shoulder and elbow injuries demonstrated significantly more scapular anterior tilt during humeral elevation compared to those without an injury. It was about a 3.8 degree difference. So there was some clinical relevance, but it's really important to consider, kind of why this is the case. So big picture, scapular anterior tilt is a problem with just about everybody. If we want to dumb it down to what the motion looks like, it's a shoulder that's rounded forward. So if you put your hand on the backside of a neutral rib cage resting posture, you're going to get a prominence of the inferior medial border. So that inside bottom border of the scapula is going to be tilted off the rib cage. So we want those things to be snug together. It should be a really good convex concave relationship. Sometimes we get a really flat upper back, which makes the shoulder blades look like they're in a even worse position than they are. But in this particular case, they're talking about how the scapula has just sat into too much anterior tilt. Now, we need to talk more importantly on why this study is significant, because I think if you talk to most people in the industry, they wouldn't be surprised at these results. It's a good reaffirmation of a lot of the stuff we know. But the first point is anytime you're in anterior tilt, it's more direct irritation at rest. Okay, so if you consider, why grandfathers have rotator cuff problems, people that sit at computers all day, they generally tend to be in more, thoracic flexion, and in this case, scapular anterior tilt, which is driven by the position of the upper back in some cases. And we know that your glenohumeral joint, really, impingement is a physiological norm. You're working with about 5 degrees of clearance, basically between the superior aspect of the humeral head and the acromion process. And there's structures in the middle. There's your bursa, you have your rotator cuff tendons, and these things basically get impinged on a regular basis. So when you're more anteriorly tilted, you are more likely to impinge on the anterior aspect of the joint. So, this classic external impingement, they call it, is something we see a lot more in kind of a weight training population, people who spend too much time at computers, just your classic, what people would call poor posture folks. So when you have very little scapular posterior tilt to kind of open up the front of the joint and give people a little bit more space, they are going to hang out on those structures a lot more just at rest. And certainly they're going to grind through it when they go through some of their weight training stuff and things like that. Presumably all 85 athletes in this study, had some kind of weight training involved. So chances are they were using a few bullets just in there beyond just what they did with their throwing stuff. So the first thing is it doesn't give those structures much rest between outings when you're always kind of hanging on to it. And it probably brings people to a little bit more of a degenerative threshold in those positions. Now, that doesn't really speak to how it impacts elbows. So what I always talk about is that scapular posterior tilt gives you some free layback. So you imagine this point when your arm just lays back, your forearm is parallel to the ground. People think it's just shoulder external rotation, but in reality, when you lay your arm back, it's a combination of thoracic extension and rotation. So your upper back has to move. You have this scapular posterior tilt, the ability to tip the shoulder blade back on the rib cage. And then you have shoulder external rotation. And then you have elbow valgus. There's going to be some gapping on your elbow. You don't want it to gap too much because that's usually when ligaments go and you wind up with some kind of UCL reconstruction intervention. So in this pattern, you want to ask as little of the elbow as possible. And I think what happens all too often is we have people who get really stuck in scapular anterior tilt. And there's, it's kind of a sign of everything else that's going on, right? If you have poor posterior tilt of your scapula, usually there isn't very good thoracic extension and rotation. The rib cage get a little bit stuck, which I'll talk about in a second here. And then what you wind up is they try to get more shoulder external rotation. So they may glide forward with the humeral head, in the capsule and create, a subscap strain or an anterior capsule injury or something along those lines. So as a good rule of thumb, we want to ask as little of the elbow as possible. And I really think one of the things that's really vitally important is if you look at the research, I think a lot of times we see really inflated shoulder external rotation passive numbers when we lay people back on the table. And there's actually some couple of really good studies that I think have done a meticulous job of measuring this. But what's actually happening with these folks, I think, is that people who are in a semblance of anterior tilt, if you push back on their humeral head when you measure, you can kind of inflate their shoulder ER numbers, and also you may just be getting more valgus numbers. So I prefer a much more kind of stringent shoulder ER measurement to give us some insights into exactly what's happening at that joint. So big picture, layback is really important. You have to have a lot of control of it. You have to have sufficient layback so you're not just asking an elbow to become more than a hinge joint. But the last one is something I want to bring to your attention. And Bill Hartman really put this on my radar, and it was a big aha moment. So definitely check Bill's work out. But one of the things that's really fascinating on the anatomical side of things is your pec minor, which is one of the muscles that really drives scapular anterior tilt. And it's always that one that, from a treatment standpoint is really gritty and fibrotic and people don't love to get it treated. It's underneath pec major, so it's kind of hard to get to. You got to get it from the side. But it attaches not just on the coracoid process of your scapula, but it attaches on ribs 3 through 5. So it will pull the scapula down, but everybody talks about how that impacts the shoulder positions, right? But no one really speaks to it's dense at the other end, right? It impacts how the rib cage moves. And so it attaches at ribs 3 through 5. The fifth rib is also where the rectus abdominis comes up and attaches. That's the superior most attachment in most people. So what you have is a lot of times these athletes who are very anteriorly tilted, they're also athletes who have lifted a ton of weights. They have this big time bracing strategy, and their rectus abdominis is very, very stiff. Shirley Sarman's talked about this for decades, right? So if you have these things both basically playing a tug of war over that fifth rib, what you wind up with is a rib cage that really can't move, right? It can't rotate. It can't extend through the thoracic spine nearly as much. People just look kind of clenched down. Bill would talk about how the sternum doesn't expand on inhale. He would refer to a lot of these guys as compressed, narrow infrasternal angles. Excellent stuff from him on this. That was a big time aha moment for me. And it has implications on all this stuff, right? You have to be able to posteriorly tilt your scapula basically to get some more layback the right way, and also to give some of those tissues a break at rest. Now, here's the problem. Most people teach posterior tilt work wrong, right? They're trying to get some lower trap activation, and instead what they do is they just aggressively pull into scapular depression and really use the lats, or basically they stay in anterior tilt and they grind away through the humerus. So we're very meticulous in the way that we teach it. It's something that's at the start of every single program. We do a lot of isometric holds so people can actually feel what they're supposed to do. We also make sure that the rib cage is in a good position. You don't want to just put somebody who's got a really flat thoracic spine, face down on a table and have them just arch their back and grind away while they're trying to do it. So this is one of the reasons why I'm not a big fan of the YTWL series. I think, we need to break a lot of those exercises out and really teach people how to get motion in the right places. So big takeaway from today, awesome study just came out. reaffirmed what we mostly already know. Scapular posterior tilt is an absolute game changer for folks of all walks of life, but particularly baseball players. Make sure you teach it correctly. This is something we hammered home in my Sturdy Shoulders course. That's sturdyshoulders.com if you want to check it out. And then certainly take advantage of this sale on thoracic outlet syndrome diagnosis and treatments. You can check that out at ericcressey.com/thoracic outlet. That's $50 off through this Sunday at midnight. Thanks so much for listening and have an awesome weekend.